Welcome to Professor Tony Bogues. We are just absolutely delighted that you had the time to squeeze this in. We have so much to learn from you in this moment and generally. So Professor Bogues is someone who, for his entire life, has sat at the intersection of action and scholarship, has been out in the world transforming it for the better, and working on how to think through the past and give us a framework for understanding the past, the present, and of course, the future too. He, like some of the speakers who are coming up at the center, is engaged in a project that's also interested in possible futures. So he's the inaugural director of the Ruth J. Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University. He is the author and editor of 12 books and over 100 articles in the fields of African and African diasporic political thought and theory. And he has also been working on Caribbean art and how politics and art intersect. He's written a series of biographies, including one on the Haitian artist André Pierre and another on the life and times of Michael Manley. He's also written on C.L.R. James. I wanted to linger for a minute on Michael Manley, the Democratic Socialist former leader of Jamaica, who was a figure that Professor Bogues knew personally and in fact worked closely with in the 1980s in order to shape this exciting experiment in social activism and in politics in the Caribbean. Professor Bogues is completing an intellectual biography of the Caribbean theorist, Sylvia Weinter. I'm so sorry, Professor Bogues, you're going to have to correct me on that pronunciation. And he's also edited a volume on art and the Haitian Revolution. So we're just absolutely delighted to have Professor Bogues with us. His accolades go on, but I know that you all are here not to listen to me, but to listen to him. So I'm going to pass the mic to you, Professor Bogues, and thank you again for joining us for this urgent talk.
Okay, thank you all very, very much. As I said to Adrian, that I regret I'm not being in Wisconsin, but it was, the timing is just really very difficult at this specific point in time. But I really want to thank you all for the invitation from the Havens Wright Center for Social Justice to speak. I've spent some time thinking about what my subject should be, and hence the title that I've given to you all, which is American Politics, the Rise of Illiberalism, a Black Critique Perspective. What I'm going to try and do is to think about American society in its, at the moment, so contemporaneously, but I'm going to try and do it from a certain perspective, a certain tradition, from a certain tradition that I operate in, which is the Black radical tradition. I think that many of us will agree today that we inhabit a time of crisis. This is, of course, sometimes spoken about with alarm and sometimes with some kind of trepidation. Crisis, of course, is a much overused word. And perhaps it has been so overused that it has been gutted of its original meanings. Original meanings of internal trouble or danger. However, I want to deploy the term crisis as thinking about a turning point in the Gramscian sense. That is a point in which the old is dying, but the new cannot or is not yet born. In such a context, Gramsci noted that during this period, when the old is dying, but the new has not yet given birth, that this is a period in which he calls the interregnum, in which he says morbid symptoms appear. And when I say the old is dying, what I want to do is suggest to you that the old I'm talking about is the social formation of neoliberalism. In our present conjuncture, the emerging new has not yet fully consolidated itself, but it has been called by many names. But the name that I think applies is some kind of authoritarianism. America is not the only case of this in the world. In Germany, there is the victory over the last couple of days of the AfD, which is a fascist party. In Hungary, we know that there's authoritarianism. In Netherlands, there is a drift as well to authoritarianism. And in the United States, we have Trumpism. Here at home, the word fascist or fascism is being used to describe Trumpism. It is being deployed to mark a break from the conventional foundations of American political thought, of liberalism and liberal democracy. It is obviously clear that American society is at a turning point. But perhaps the question that we need to ask is this turning point a rupture? That is a turning point a rupture from liberalism, or is it a contemporary culmination of historical currents in American society, which are now today being consolidated? And obviously, if they are become consolidated in this contemporary moment, then they become a rupture. But are we there yet? I'm therefore working through with you and with others the naming of the present conjuncture and to understand its historical unfolding. In doing this, I want to argue that the old, which is neoliberalism, is on, as I said, dying, but not yet dead fully. When people think about neoliberalism, they mark its emergence typically with the 1980 phalanx of a group of politicians, Thatcher from England, President Reagan from United States, and Chancellor Kohl from what was then called West Germany. But I want to go back a bit before 1980. I want to go to 1976. And I want to go when I go to 76, to point out the Chilean destabilization process, which overthrew Salvador Allende and brought in the Pinochet regime. The Pinochet regime, as we know, was a totalitarian one, following the usage of word totalitarian by folks by individuals and theorists like Hannah Arendt. It was a regime in which terror and death were regularized practices. But it was also a kind of regime in which the free market fundamentalism at the economic level was the order of the day. It was in Chile that the people from the Chicago School, the Milton Friedman School of thinking about economics and market fundamentalism, where they first did their practices. In 1980, I would again, just before I would argue the consolidation of neoliberalism, you had the overthrow of the Manley regime. And then that overthrow of the Manley regime installed it was both a military and political defeat of the Manley regime, installed a neoliberal regime in October of 1980. That particular period was marked by destabilization and military violence. In the United States, during this period, we saw the emergence of the carceral state and the war on drugs within the African American communities. So the point I'm making is that before the actual consolidation of neoliberalism and the phalanx of the three leaders who I've spoken about, before they could put their full stamp and consolidate what Stuart Hall calls the neoliberal revolution, that there were a set of events that we have to take note of that led up to this consolidation. In other words, what I'm also trying to point to is how before consolidation appears, currents emerge and unfold. And as they unfold, they actually begin to create in their wake certain things about society that actually shake up and change the society in which they're unfolding. As we know, neoliberalism became also known as globalization. And this globalization essentially engendered profound inequalities in the world, became known in the United States as the Second Gilded Age. It was a period in which billionaires were formed on a regular basis. In 1970, in this country, there were about 5 billionaires. Between 1982 and 1987, there were 44 billionaires. In March 2020, just 5 years ago, they were announced there were 610 billionaires. Part of the results of this globalization and neoliberalism, therefore, and it was not just the growth in inequalities, but the rapid growth of an elite that was essentially circled around being billionaires. Part of that was what we now see that came out of the technological revolution. Stuart Hall, however, made the point that one of the fundamental things about neoliberalism was that the market became the model, he said, of social relations. Exchange value, he says, became the only value. And I would add to this that in this particular moment, at that particular moment, when exchange value became the primary value and market fundamentalism became the frame for discussion, not just of politics and economics, that all that happened within the profound crisis of climate change. Within the American context, I think it's important to note that the Clinton administration between 1993 and 2001 put neoliberalism in the driver's seat in very fundamental ways. And that the Obama administration after that, in the mid-2000s, essentially managed those particular elements that were part of neoliberalism. But there's one additional thing that I think is important for us to begin to understand, that neoliberalism, as it happens in the United States, is also happening in a context in which America is an empire. The beginning of the 20th century and what was typically known as the rise of America really also saw the consolidation of America as an empire, now not just internally, i.e., that is because of the way it dealt with the indigenous people and the consolidation and activity of secular colonialism, but certainly by the end of the 19th and early 20th century, America was an empire externally. What kind of empire it was is something that we can discuss. I myself have made it clear that I think by the time you get to the mid-20th century, the nature of America as an empire has changed, not just has changed from just normal imperial and financial dominance, but to what Winston Churchill argued in the 1940s, when the British colonialism was collapsing, that what he wanted now to set up was an empire of the mind. And then I would argue that the empire of the mind that the United States sets up by the time you get to the 1930s and 40s is an empire of the mind in which democracy is supposed to be the signature political frame, or electoral democracy is a signature political frame. The collapse or the unsettling of neoliberalism really comes to a climax, I would argue, or begins to unravel very quickly in the recession of 2008. But there are also other things at that moment that we need to pay attention to. One of them is the Occupy movement of 2011, in which the movement identified the 1% versus the 99%. But also, very importantly, I think, that we need to pay attention to the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013. In other words, that what you have is the recession in 2008, but you also have, I think importantly, the Occupy movement in 2011 and the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013. So that the unraveling of neoliberalism was not just an economic recession, but was also a sort of political and social activity by sections, particularly of the American population. The unraveling of neoliberalism in 2008, however, also, I think, saw the emergence of other social and other political formations. And particularly here, I'm referring specifically to the Tea Party, which was sponsored, as we know, by an organization called Americans for Prosperity. The Tea Party, as we know, entered the Republican Party, and a lot of its program was quickly adopted by that party. But perhaps more importantly is that they all emerged after the Tea Party, 2009, something called birtherism. Birtherism becomes really important because birtherism has a set of qualities to it that are specifically American. If you all recall, birtherism emerges when people began to ask the question, where was President Obama born? And therefore, could he be the American president, since one of the constitutional rules is that you can't be president unless you are born in the United States. The formation of birtherism, in my view, grew out of a couple of things. Firstly, it grew out of the very fact that the anti-Black racism in this country now had to face the fact that an African American was now going to be or could be president. That fact, I would argue, really created consternation amongst many racists in this country. But also part of birtherism, I would argue, is fueled by and rests upon and embedded within a certain feature of American politics, which one can call conspiracy theory. The fact of the thing about birtherism as well is that it is rooted in a long history in this country around the questions of migration and nationality. From about 1790s, there was the big discussion in this country about the white nation, about individuals who could be naturalized. There was discussion about individuals who were supposed to be obnoxious. This discussion got as far as the Supreme Court, which ruled at one stage that there was a common understanding of America, and that common understanding of America was about race and therefore who could be naturalized. All of that obviously was a backdrop to the Chinese Exclusion Act. But it was also a backdrop to the 19th century discussion and practices of American empire as it moved westward. In other words, the internal consolidation of American as an empire was also at the level of political discourse and narrative organized not just around taking over lands that were supposed to be empty, but were also rested on who could actually do this, who were the citizens of this particular country. So what you have, therefore, with the birtherism is a reactivation of a set of arguments that were there from the 1790s. And what I would want to suggest to you is that with birtherism and conspiracy theory, that what you are beginning to see is a reactivation of secular colonial logics about America. And that this reactivation obviously is embedded in an ideology of white supremacy. So here you have the collapse or the unraveling of neoliberalism in 2008. You also have the Occupy movement, you have the Black Lives Matter movement, but what you also have is the Tea Party and then the emergence of birtherism. So these are the social forces and this kind of set of ideas, political ideas, which are gaining life and which are in contestation, I would argue, in United States right after as the recession begins to dig deep and as the neoliberalism project begins to unravel. We know, of course, that the neoliberalism project also got manufacturing because of the rise of technology. We also know that the neoliberalism project is, as I said, is a put to what I like to call put on speed dial, a certain kind of financialization process which creates billionaires. But importantly, because of technology, we know that the neoliberalism project is also about the reorganization of human life as well as the reorganization of capital. All these things I would want to suggest to you are the conditions for the emergence of the new conjuncture that we are now in. And so the question that faces us, the question I asked a few minutes ago, in this new conjuncture, in a moment when neoliberalism is dying but not yet dead, are we in a moment of rupture? To answer that question, I want to present another narrative of American history and political thought. It's not just one narrative. There's another narrative which I think is important for us to grasp or to think about, and it is this. Firstly, the narrative begins by making the point that the so-called American experiment begins with secular colonialism, is reorganized around questions of racial slavery. That when people like de Tocqueville in 1831 begins to talk about American exceptionalism, that what he is talking about or what he is ignoring is, what he's ignoring is that the ways in which America is not really exceptional in relationship to race, and particularly in relationship to class, and also in relation to gender, but also importantly, to its secular colonialism, secular colonialist practices. In the 1950s, political scientists and political thought in the United States, particularly through the work of Lewis Harris and so on, talked about a a consistent liberal tradition in United States. But I want to argue that that consistent liberal tradition in United States, because that tradition is not just a Lockean tradition, or is it another a tradition that comes out of a certain kind of natural rights tradition, but that tradition also had a liberal side to it. In other words, the point I'm making is that the emergence of illiberalism in the United States was there at the inauguration of the Republic, at the inauguration of the experiment. So that you can only understand that point, I think, I'm making if you think about the ways in which there's a Fugitive Slave Act in the 1850s, not just slavery, or if you think about the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which deals with the question of can the slaves be, and this is the question that the Supreme Court judge posed, can the slaves be constituent members of, and here I quote him, we the people? The Justice Stoney at the time, said, we think that they are not. And I quote him, further quote him, and they are not to be included in we the people. He goes on, they had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white man. They had no rights, he continues, which the white man must respect. He ends his judgment with this: a Negro of the African race is an article of property. Close of citation. No wonder then that Frederick Douglass in 1852, in his remarkable speech, What is the Slave, in the 4th of July, could say, I am excluded within the pale of this glorious anniversary. The rich inheritance of justice and of liberty and prosperity is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must, Douglass says, mourn. And it is this business, therefore, of the illiberalism of so-called liberal United States and liberal tradition. Specifically as I'm talking about it now, in relationship to the African American population, but also very much to the indigenous population. It is this illiberalism that I want to argue that has always been a current in United States. And that the question that one has to ask at this moment is this a rupture that we're now witnessing, or is this a certain culmination of this kind of illiberalism that has always existed? As recent as 1987, the brilliant Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was the legal director of the NAACP before he became a Supreme Court justice, refused an invitation to speak at the 200th anniversary of the United States Constitution in Philadelphia. In his letter, he said, in his letter of refusal, he says, the government, talking about the Constitution, the government they devised was defective from the start. This defectiveness, I want to argue, is a defectiveness of a certain kind of illiberalism. Certain kind of illiberalism born within the matrices of the violences of racial slavery and of secular colonialism. One way that people in political thought and theory and in practice of politics try to think about this illiberalism or this liberalism and the way in which then there it has illiberal practices to it is this idea that somehow one of the things about America as an exception is that there is a never-ending expanding, a kind of almost infinite arc of expansion of equality. And in this regard, people point to the Civil War of 1865 and to the 13th and 14th Amendments. But I would want to argue that this idea of never expanding, always expanding, of the infinite kind of ways in which liberalism can expand itself to actually to create equality is deeply flawed. It is flawed because it primarily resides in law. It does not deal with the questions of history. It does not deal with the ways in which history, as I've argued, is a kind of sedimented deposit, and how that history can reformulate and readapt itself in the present, in different moments. If we come to the indigenous population, I want to point out to you the actual court cases of 1831, in which the Justice Marshall made the point that even though the indigenous population were not foreign nations, they were domestic dependent nations within the United States. And also to remind you that indigenous Native Americans did not become citizens and had the right to vote until 1924. What is always interesting to me when I think about this in American political thought and American history, and think about this particular court case, is how in the 1830s, the idea of the indigenous people being a foreign, not a foreign, but a dependent nation in the United States, and therefore that they are wards of the federal system, that a couple of years later on, at the end of the 19th century, this was the precise language that was used for the colonization of Puerto Rico. Racial slavery, I would want to suggest to you all, made America a slave society. There was no business of the South being the split site of slavery, with plantations, and then the North, this pristine place of city of the hill, on the hill, and of full equality. We now know that the economic structures of slavery, of racial slavery, was one in which the North did a lot of the financing, and the plantations and the South actually practiced forms of slavery on plantations. But the North itself was a site of slavery, as well, as we look at the petitions of many of the people in Massachusetts around trying to end slavery. But the point I want to make about racial slavery is that racial slavery as a social formation and social system was a system in which there was a drive for total domination. It was a system in which W.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction and has made it clear, a system in which the people, the enslaved African, the enslaved Black person, was under the arbitrary will of the master. And if you think about that in political terms and social terms, to be under the arbitrary will of somebody is a form of domination. To think of, therefore, also in American history of the ways in which Reconstruction was defeated and the emergence of Jim Crow and segregation, or what some people have called American apartheid. And then think of, therefore, how is it that American society has always had illiberalism deep in its roots, how this illiberalism continues to shape American society, and how it may have gone underground for some time, but actually then explodes at different points in time in American history. With regard to the African American population, we know that racial domination continues after racial slavery, after the fall legal fall of Jim Crow and the formal legal ending of segregation. And we know that for the African American community, that racial domination creates a situation where the Black body is disposable. George Jackson, in my view, one of the most important political thinkers of Black life in this country, in an essay in Blood in My Eye, describes Black life this way. We are born, he says, to a premature death, a menial subsistence, wage workers, odd job man, the cleaners, the man under the hood. We are born in a society where, he says, anybody who can pass a civil service exam can kill me today or kill me tomorrow. He describes the actual condition, therefore, of Black African Americans. In 1972, he describes it as fascism. Fascism, he says, is a counter-revolutionary movement. It is a movement which we see at this late stage in the socio-economic development of capitalism. The point he wants to make is that fascism is a kind of rule that covers or is imposed upon the African American population. Now, I think this is really critical because what I think George Jackson is pointing to is that there is a so-called state of exception for the African American population. What Dr. Felicia Denard from the University of Cincinnati has called a certain permanent state of war. If this one thinks about, therefore, Black life in the United States as existing under this permanent state of war, then again the question is posed, in this moment of authoritarianism, can we be surprised at Trump or Trumpism? I want to use the phrase of Malcolm X, have the chickens not come home to roost? And therefore, to come back to the question that I've been circling around, is it now therefore a rupture? Is it a rupture when the current of illiberalism, which has been foundational to American quote-unquote liberalism, when it is now moving to be a dominant current, when it is moving to attempt to reorganize the institutions of American politics? There is something new, though, in the situation. Stuart Hall always made it clear to us that in trying to think about the conjuncture, we have to try and see what are some of the new currents. In other words, what are the new ways in which people are at the level of political discourse and practice, people are engaged in certain things. What new political language, in other words, may be emerging? In this particular moment, one political language that is emerging is something called the deep state. And the deep state, or the administrative state, is something not just by Steve Bannon alone, it is also in Project 2025. The deep state is understood by these people as a state in which there is a group of secret people, elites, they call them, whom secretly manipulate government. And they manipulate government, allowing and here I quote them, the extremist ideologies, people from the radical left in particular, to have a place in government. The deep state, they argue, is about actors who are globalists, about bankers, about Islamists, and about establishment Republicans. And therefore, one of the things I think when one wants to think about this conjuncture and think about how people begin who are now in power are beginning to think about the state and what they need to do in the state, the kind of removals which they signal from us, which is signaled in 2025 document, only that it also has revenge as part of it. That what you have to also, I think, begin to understand, or one has to begin to understand, is how this is linked to questions of the idea of conspiracy. In other words, that you have a situation in which the notion of conspiracy, which is important in American politics from the 1800s forward, which I've identified contemporaneously as the birthers in the birthers movement, and lied to white supremacy, is that what now happens is that there's an idea that the elites are now, some elites, the liberal elites, have conspired to take America in a certain position, which allows for what they call the radical left, and sometimes they call the Marxists, to actually find ways and to work within the American state itself, which means therefore that one of the actions of those persons who are now in charge has got to be the removal of persons in the state apparatuses, in different elements of it, not just for fiscal reasons, but also for deep political reasons. Another particular feature of this moment is the ways in which billionaires, all coming out of the neoliberal movement, essentially, and neoliberalism, and also the rapid opening of the development of technologies in the last 20 years or so, how that group of persons, social group, is now fused with the group of people that I think on the current that is now thinking about the deep state and the administrative state and how to change that state. So what you get therefore in the form of people like Elon Musk is a fusion, is not just a relationship between money and politics, but it is actually a fusion of money and politics. And then this toxic fusion of money and politics, therefore, is at the heart, I would want to argue, of a certain kind of authoritarianism that is emerging inside the United States. Some sociologists, and somebody pointed this out to me recently on the weekend, have talked about Weber's thinking around patrimonialism, in which there's a certain style of politics, which is very much a personal style, and which is marked primarily by loyalty, and which opens up the doors to corruption. I understand that kind of terminology, but I would argue that what you're seeing is not patrimonialism in the Weberian sense. That what you're seeing is a certain a certain openness, a certain ways in which the underbelly, the illiberal elements, if you wish, because they're not underbelly, the illiberal elements of United States society have all now climaxed into this particular moment. The question that we have to ask ourselves, I think, are two. Those of us who have fundamental disagreements with this kind of political practice and with this political current need to then think about a perennial question that has always been in politics: what is to be done? I would argue that one of the things we need to do is a return to a set of historical archives, and to understand those historical archives as ways in which new imaginaries and possibilities were put before us. And that the second thing that we might want to think about is a political practice of disobedience. American illiberalism did not create a democracy. It created a society of deep inequality. It created a society in which racial domination was an important marker. It was not an exceptional city on the hill. We now need to confront the illiberalism would shape our society so that we can pass over to the river Jordan. Thanks very much.
Am I there? Thank you so much. Actually, it was meant, to applaud the talk. But I can ask a question in a way. Thank you so much, Tony, for this wonderful talk. Thank you so much. My question is in not playing with words, but what would happen to the idea of neoliberalism when we have brought this critique of illiberalism? What is a liberal in the neoliberalism in your discussion? Are you deploying it in the American case while we have had this historical illiberalism? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen, for coming. I know it's very late for you. So I really thank you for joining. I mean, the argument I'm trying to make is really as simple as I think is a complex one, but let me try and put it very simply. The dominant argument about America is that it is a liberal society. It's an exceptional society. It's a city on the hill. It's the society in which God has entrusted the future of the world and so on and so forth. That's the general argument. My argument is that American was born not just as a liberal society, but it was born as an illiberal society. And that what I've been trying to tease out for the last couple of months, frankly, are the ways in which that illiberalism, and I don't use the word totalitarian, that illiberalism has actually always been there. And it's been there around the African American way, the racial domination, and is there because of secular colonialism, and therefore questions of white supremacy. But I think when we kind of get caught in a language that says, this is a racist, what they're doing is racist, which it is, it's anti-Black racism. And then somehow we think, okay, if we are just liberal, then we can then begin to deal with them in a certain way. Or what did we deal with deal with the ways and the practices that are now, that are there before us. My argument is that you are looking at the illiberal and therefore authoritarian trends in American society, and that's the current that is now in power. And that what is new, I think, about this is there are two things. One, the fusion of the billionaire class and this power, and around questions of technology. And I didn't get into some of the ideologies that govern that. Something called transhumanism. But that secondly, you are also seeing the business of conspiracy, right? And it is and that when you fuse all of that together, you really begin to get this configuration of power today, which faces us. So that I am not, so for me, illiberalism, and I use the word illiberalism because I was trying to think about what else to use. Illiberalism is born as well as so-called liberal traditions, right? And they are born together in this United States. And that what that therefore means is that this idea of being a liberal society, this idea that of an ever-expanding infinite expansion of equality and so on is actually false. That you may have a situation where certain things happen the ending of slavery or the ending of Jim Crow. But that because at its heart, at its foundation, is a certain kind of illiberalism, that these things will always be in danger. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Thank you so much for that. We have a question from Professor Keisha Lindsay. Keisha writes, thank you so much for this great talk. My question is as follows. If we accept your argument that current political events reflect the US's deeply entrenched illiberalism, that disappeared. Is there any value in attempting to distinguish this ongoing reality from fascism? Or is it the case that they are the same thing? Great question.
No, I don't think illiberalism and fascism are the same thing. I'm very cautious about using the word fascism. And I may end up saying that, but I'm very cautious because what I want to point to colleagues is that we need to Stuart Hall had a thing, and CLR James also had this sign, that you need to always study the concrete before you name it. Okay? And so what I'm trying to do is to think about the concrete American instantiation. Because if we then say of what we are now seeing, so that if we say that, for example, oh, this is fascism, then immediately it invokes a set of political features which are not yet present. They may very well be present, but later on, but are not yet present. This is why I say this is an unfolding situation. Okay, so we may very well be in a moment that's going to lead us to fascism, and that's fascism is a different kind of political, political system, political and social system, which I think we need to think about what that means. When George Jackson says that this is fascism, what he's talking about is the way in which the African American population is treated through racial domination, the murders, the racial discrimination, etc., the disposable body, and so on. We are not there yet, in my view. But so that what we have to do, at my view, you could be wrong, is about trying to understand the concrete and to be able to then name the process of unfolding and the conjunction so that we can begin to struggle against it. And this is why I end up with disobedience, right? At this moment, in my view, a disobedience that when you are confronted in the way I think we are confronted, where the heart of the actual regime is about obey, and you have to obey, then the part of what one is thinking about, the experience, political experience that one needs to invoke, is a history of disobedience. And we have in this country a long history of disobedience that creates mass movements. And here I'm thinking, obviously, of things like the Southern Freedom Movement and the work of King and others.
Wonderful.
So I hope that answers your question.
We have a question from the chat. Someone writes, I'm interested in how you think about the articulation of illiberalism and imperialism. You talked about how neoliberalism is dying, but in this interregnum, we cannot see what may come next. Are things clearer in terms of international relations? What do you think of the US's new imperial repositioning?
I think that those of us that come from the global south don't see this as new. I'm afraid, I'm sorry, right? One of the things about political thought in this country and political practice is that people don't think about America as an empire, right? Or they think about only America as an empire through secular colonialism internally. Those of us who come from elsewhere and have lived that, have felt the actual, how should I put it, the might of American empire, understand that these practices, America has always been an empire, okay? Not from 1776, obviously, but certainly by the time you get to Manifest Destiny, an internal empire, westward movement, and then an empire outside, externally in Latin America and the Caribbean, the American lake, and so on, the establishment of military bases around the world. I mean, we can go through all of that. So I think that the illiberalism, that what people call American imperialism, what I like to call American empire, is actually part of the illiberal current that exists in the United States. But it is mixed with, because this is the complication of trying to think through politics concretely, it is mixed with liberalism. So that in the neoliberal period, the ways in which the American empire moved was not that it did not invade Afghanistan, it did. Not that it did not invade Iraq, which it did, and all of those kind of things. Not that it hasn't, the way it has treated Cuba and so on. All of those things that we can point to. But I would want to argue that because of the kind of illiberal and liberal configuration that makes up this American political thought and practice, that at the heart of American empire was what I call desire, an imaginary. In other words, that the heart of neoliberalism was an imaginary in which was what we can call consumer freedom. You then began to think of yourself as free. Right? Now it wasn't about democracy. It was about freedom. And you began to think about yourself as free, but it was on the socks you buy, the soaps you can use, etc., 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 etc. Right? So it was about it is taking Churchill's empire of the mind to what I call an empire of desire. And that becomes very important, because if you get then to construct a human being where his or her desire is about a certain kind of consumer freedom, you don't need to knock them on the head. Right? Might does not need to appear. Might appears when you cannot control people. But if you can create a certain hegemony, to use following Gramsci's formulation, if you can create a certain hegemony, you don't need to knock people on the head. And this society has the enormous capacity to create a spectacle of hegemony.
Wonderful. Thank you. Michelle Kahn writes, this was fantastic. Thank you. Is this illiberal underbelly a feature of American liberalism specifically, or of liberalism period? Or is this a feature of so-called liberal empires? He's thinking about this dilemma in the context of the British Empire.
Yeah, I think the last part of the question is important. In other words, I would argue that part of liberalism generally, and I didn't want to get into that because it's a much more complicated argument, and I think this argument is already complex. I didn't want to give that part of the colonial project, as the European colonial project becomes, as liberalism emerges in the 18th century in parts of Europe, in 19th century, as part of Europe, then in fact, yes, and the arguments around colonialism shift. So it shifts from these people are savages to, certainly in the British case, to, okay, we can make these people subjects. We can make these people, we can practice a civilization mission. Or in the French case, we can do an assimilation project, right? So that increasingly as the liberalism in Europe begins to take hold as a political philosophy, then there needs to be a certain kind of justification for the colonial project. And in that justification, the language shifts about who colonize and who's the native, and particularly around Black folks. And so that you can see that, and I'll give you one concrete example as to what I mean. The debate after 1865 that occurs in the British Parliament between John Stuart Mills, Charles Darwin, and Charles Dickens. What's the debate about? There's a rebellion in Jamaica amongst the Black small farmers who were previously enslaved. The governor, colonial British governor, puts down the rebellion with massacre, with hanging, hanging left, right, and center, and really massacres, quite frankly. John Stuart Mill, who is the philosopher of liberalism, argues that what the government did, the government error, spelled EYR, was wrong. What you should be doing is that thinking about these people now who have been recently enslaved as what? As now subjects of the Queen, subjects of the realm, and the British realm, and therefore, even though they do not have full rights of citizenship, they should be treated as subjects. 40 years ago, they would be treated as slaves. Okay? And what what Dickens is arguing, so he and Darwin are, arguing that position. And what Charles Dickens argues is no, these people only eat watermelon. These people, in that language, and what you need, and that Governor Eyre was right to knock them on the head and to do the massacre. But at that moment in British society, there is a discussion about liberalism in the politics. So that the point I am making is that there is a liberal empire. My point is that in the liberal empire, what becomes dominant, or one of the things that emerges is in political language and discourse is what? Is that now you civilize these people. Okay? And later on in the 21st century, after independence and so on, and there's a new world configuration, it becomes what desires can we give them.
Thank you for that. Kevin Lawrence Henry writes, Dr. Bogues, thank you for this wonderful and critically important talk. I'm thinking about your recommendation that we return to a set of historical archives that may very well allow us to imagine and practice. I'm also thinking about your earlier work on the Black radical tradition, specifically Black heretics, Black prophets. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about that archive and perhaps offer us some examples or suggestions on where to begin.
The archive I'm trying to think about from my own work begins with an archive of the enslaved Africans that begins to describe politics around questions of freedom, not liberty. If you read carefully the petitions from Prince Hall onwards in this country, they take up the word liberty, because that's the word of the 1776 revolution. And they juxtapose against that word business of freedom. If you take up in the enslaved, archive of the enslaved, the business when emancipation happens, people talk about emancipation of the slaves, whether it's in the United States, in England, or Caribbean, or in Brazil, or wherever. The slaves themselves don't talk about emancipation. They talk about freedom. So what is my point? My point is that the historical archive of those persons who have been enslaved and whose enslavement is, in my view, one of the foundation planks of the making of the modern world, to create and develop a different conception of what freedom looks like. Okay? So that the one archive is to examine those archives, not to see something about slave freedom, but to begin to understand that freedom is not emancipation, that freedom is not liberty, that freedom might mean something else. And there's no telos to that else, right? That it is also what Fanon would call a constant reinvention of it, a constant bringing of invention into existence. That's his words and his phrase in Black Skin, White Mask. So that is to think about what does that mean. Think about that constantly experimentation of what it means to be human, and because human, not in an individual way, because Fanon also makes the point that that my freedom was given to me to create the world of the you. So that therefore, whatever freedom you are thinking about is about a relational freedom. Is a freedom between us. Is a freedom of what I call forming bonds of common association to do certain things in societies. So that therefore, to do that, in my view, means what? Means that you have to think about questions of equality. And if you go back to the Haitian Revolution, and Haiti is a much maligned place today, and given all that's happening, nobody wants to look at it. But one of the things that always strikes me is what questions were raised in that 18th century revolution. how enslaved women raised the question of equal pay for equal work. Because the question of freedom is not separate from the question of equality. In the West, it is. People say if you have equality, you throw freedom through the window. People say if you have freedom, you have to throw is individual freedom, I have to throw equality through the window. So my business is what are the historical archives? Is the archive of the enslaved. Is the archive of what? Is the archive in the African liberation movements before they become political parties proclaiming their socialism. In other words, that in many of these political movements, what we call national liberation movements, profound questions of democracy were being raised in opposition to the colonial state and opposition to colonial rule. Those things have been lost. If you want to look at one of them, get back the late Basil Davidson's book on the struggle in Guinea-Bissau and the work of Amilcar Cabral. And in the United States, it is go back to the work of a radical king, go back to the Southern Freedom Movement, right? These are go back to the Black abolitionist movements in this country. Understand the Black abolition as one of the most important 19th century reformist movement in the world, not the International Working Men's Association. But the most important was the Black abolitionist movement, the conferences that they had in England and in Scotland and all over the world. So that those are the set of archives, and archives around radical forms of democracy that ordinary people have attempted to practice all over the world. So it's not just Black folks. So what are those archives? Because what has happened, what neoliberalism did, was that it shut down those archives. It shut down those archives because, as Mrs. Thatcher says, there's no alternative to us. Okay? And so you have to explore that myth and begin to go back to those archives to begin to understand that, yes, there's an alternative. Yes, there's a possibility for us on this planet that is different from what is being told to us now.
I'm sad that we still have time left because that was such a mic-dropping answer to a question that I feel as though we really should have ended there, Tony, because that was so hopeful and powerful. But we're going to continue with Q&A. Someone else has written, your earlier work on the thought of C.L.R. James was incredible. What do you think of a rereading of James and other Caribbean Marxists, such as Walter Rodney, who have again become popular, and Hall, as you've mentioned? And what do they bring to our understanding of the conjuncture now? And that echoes yet another question from Gwendolyn, too, who would like you to say more about what constitutes this rupture, this conjuncture that we're discussing.
What I'm trying to argue, and I tried to make it as clear as I could, is to say that I am not sure yet we're at a rupture. And I don't know if you can call it a rupture. Even though people have been fat, even though there's craziness going on in international relations, all those kind of things. Right? But that you have to see the currents that are there before conspiracy, anti-Black racism, secular colonialism, and its toxic masculinities, all those kind of things. You have to see those, and okay, all of those things all come together, are congealed at this moment. And they are now in the mainstream of the political field. And that's called American politics. Okay, so then does that constitute a rupture? To me, the jury's out. And I don't want to wait until I get knocked on my head to say, okay, the jury is no longer out. But I want us to be very precise, as much as one can be precise. And then if you talk about fascism, a certain kind of it would be an American kind of fascism. So what does that American kind of fascism and authoritarianism look like? That may be different from Nazism. That may be different from what happened in Spain, may be different from what happened in Portugal under Salazar, may be different from what happened in Italy. That's what I'm trying to make an appeal to think concretely. And it is this business of thinking concretely that I would say that both Stuart Hall, C.L.R. James, and Walter Rodney brings to the table. In other words, that's sometimes we as academics and as scholars and thinkers and so on like to think in a big picture and then just have a set of names and our categorical names, put them on the table and say this is what it is, without making any profound attempt to try and tease out the actual elements of the concrete. So so what I'm trying to do is to say, what is the concrete? What is the everyday? How do we think about these things? How do we think about these things as they unfold and how they congeal? And those are things I take, because I come from that tradition. Those are some of the things I take from the practice and of thinking from a James, from a James, from a Walter Rodney, and from a Stuart Hall.
Thank you. Bill Balderston has written, is it possible to overcome American exceptionalism, and would it require a revolutionary assault on the structures of post-Keynesian capitalism? If so, what forces can bring that about?
I don't know what forces can bring that about. But I think it requires us to take action. Being careful with my words. It requires us to take action. What is exercised in my mind is what kind of action. And this is why I've come back to something that is, I think, fundamental, very important in the traditions of this country. And that is disobedience. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, I see that there is an element an effort to do that with the consumer. There was the Black consumer movement that said we shouldn't buy, X places and so on. But think of what disobedience that says in April, April what, 11th or whatever is end of tax, deadline for taxes, pain. All right? Think of a mass movement that essentially confronts by simply disobeying the orders that you have been given. Okay, to me, those are the kind of things that one should be thinking about. The language of revolution is nice. It's a language that Bannon himself uses, because he says, I am trying to bring about a revolution. This is a war. It is a war, but it is, in my view, how do you fight that war? From those of us who want a different life, how do we fight that war? Or what are the other less political lessons we can learn from people who have fought wars?
Thank you. Yvonne's question is, American instantiation has consequences for the rest of the world because the U.S. is a current imperial power. What does this mean for people in the world with resources and labor that are ripe for exploitation? Dangerous.
That's all I can say in one word. We are in for a moment where the extractivism is the order of the day. Right? But it's also a point, I think, where you want to think about is we are an empire in decline. Right? We're not an empire that's on the rise. It's not the beginning of the 20th century. It's not a kind of Pax Americana, right? We are empire on decline, and we are empire that is actually in political crisis, which is one of the reasons why I think Trump system was able to emerge. We can talk about that if you want. But that it is those places that have resources. Look what Ukraine faced. A plan that says, give us your resources. That's in other words, or the Palestinians. The argument about the Palestinians in Gaza is being framed now differently. The people in Cairo with their meeting yesterday, Egypt and today, are talking about, okay, let's not do the Riviera, let's do Dubai. That's a reframing of the argument for millions of people who have suffered immensely since 1948. right? So that you're looking at the reframing of arguments. That also is very important on the reframing of narrative that are basically rooted not in a kind of transactionism, but are rooted in extractivism, naked extractivism.